There wasn't much entertainment in our village. Especially if you are an adult. It's easier for the children, they each grabbed a stick, ran up the mountain, and now a whole jousting tournament began in their native village. It is more difficult for adults, jousting tournaments were not in fashion then. We had fun as much as we could. TV, gatherings over a glass of alcohol, sometimes a nightclub if it became completely boring. And the people were more active in hunting and fishing. In every house, in every entrance, one could definitely find an avid hunter or fisherman. And at the same time, it was difficult to find a fisherman, a hunter who would not know about the damned hut, which everyone tried to bypass. Unfortunately, I can't remember where exactly it was. I only remember that it was far from the village, somewhere deep in the forest. Some lovers of forest outings built themselves a hut in the forest so that there would be a place to spend the night if they came for several days. I do not know how old she was, this hut. I don't know her background. But regularly, from a variety of people, old and young, skeptics and especially impressionable, I heard a lot of different stories. All as one said that the hut is cursed. And here are some stories. History first. Old woman. 2 men, my father's friends, while fishing, stopped for the night in a hut, as they planned to continue fishing in the morning. It began to get dark, it was time to turn up and go to the hut, boil the fish soup and go to bed. We agreed that one would go ahead and start cooking while the other would pack everything and find a good place to park the boat. Further from his words.
I come to the hut, my legs don't hold at all, I'm tired during the day, as if I plowed the whole field alone. I decided to lie down for a while, rest, take a breath, and then take up my ear. There were 2 bunk beds in the hut. I lay down on one of them, on the second tier, and seemed to doze off a little. I woke up from the fact that someone slammed the door. I turn around and see an old woman crawling towards me on the stairs to the second tier, gray-haired, her skin sagging, as if she was already 300 years old, no less, straight from a horror movie. He rises slowly, looks at me without taking his eyes off and smiles maliciously. I froze with fear, I cannot move. All I could do was turn back to face the wall and close my eyes, in the hope that I was all dreaming. And I myself feel how she lay down behind me, and put her hand on me. I lay like that for about 2 minutes, and all this time she whispers something, quietly, quietly, the words cannot be made out, and laughs. The hair on my head stood on end, I feel her breath on the back of my head. He could not stand it, suddenly grew bolder, turned and yelled at her. And the grandmother immediately, at that second, as if she fell through the ground. The second comrade returned a couple of minutes later, he did not believe in the story. Until the night came. I couldn't sleep, and I was still sitting at the table by the window, looking at the dying fire, lit in the yard, when I suddenly saw an old woman standing between the trees not far from the hut and looking at him. I believed. Woke up a friend and told him. They sat together until the morning, could not sleep for fear. In the morning we packed our things and left. They did not stay in the hut anymore.
The second story. Bake. My friend's uncle told his sad experience. He went hunting alone in the winter. Decided to stay in the hut for the night. He arrived early in the morning, heated the stove well, and went hunting. As it began to get dark, he returned to the hut, had dinner and fell asleep. Further from his words.
Before I could lie down, I heard the sound of footsteps on the street. Someone is walking. I decided that it seemed. I lie down and listen. A minute, another, again steps, but this time more active, faster, as if they had switched to running. Well, I guess not exactly. At first, I did not think of anything paranormal. The hut is known to many, people often stop in it. Well, I think, the company, apparently, I will have for the night. Opened the door, closed on a hook. Went out into the street, and there is nobody, no people, no animals, no footprints. As everything was covered with snow, it remained so. I only see my footprints, left by me today. I returned to the house, I sit, I listen. It was quiet for a while. I was already thinking of going to bed, but then again I heard footsteps. The sound is distinct, not to be confused, a characteristic creaky sound, like a crust breaking under the weight of someone's legs. And then it began. Once, someone hit the wall, very, very hard. I already jumped on the spot in surprise. And then again, and again, and again. Someone beats, does not let up. Suddenly, the knocking stopped abruptly, and I hear someone walking towards the front door. My heart began to jump out of my chest. I forgot to throw the door hook back after I went out into the street. I rushed to the door, grabbed the handle, pull it towards me, and I hear footsteps very close already. I throw on the hook and freeze holding the handle. I am afraid to let go. For a minute, everything was quiet again, and suddenly, as someone blows the door with all the dope, and how let us pull out the door, pulling it back and forth, trying to break in. I am standing, frozen all over. I think, if I let go, the hook will not withstand, it will be uprooted. And again it was quiet, and again the steps were quick around the hut. I took the gun, loaded it, stood in the middle of the hut, ready to shoot, and my hands are trembling. I can't even hold it. I suddenly hear a roar on the roof. "Get on the roof, you bastard!" Stumbled, stomped and quieted down. I am waiting. Well, I think you can enter from the roof. And then I hear something climbing up the chimney. Specifically, it makes its way through it. This is where I couldn't resist. He grabbed things and jumped out of the hut like a bullet. He didn't even look back. He was so scared. I ran out to the road, jumped into the car and rushed home. I still remember, it makes me shudder.
Those are some weird stories. There are actually a lot of them. What is true, what is not, you can't make out and check. But I personally would not check it myself, probably. Now I don't know if this hut still exists or not.
The taxi driver told the story, according to his colleague, on his behalf.
Went somehow with an order. Morning, lousy road with remnants of asphalt. Suburb, but the price for the trip is good, and there are no traffic jams, the road through the forest. I thought I would go to an empty city, but to my happiness I picked up an elderly man in the middle of the way. I drove him to the entrance to the city, exchanged numbers. The man said that he often travels to those parts, and if I take such orders, he will call me. After that everything is normal. Several times this man called me, agreed, and I drove him from the outskirts of the city to the place where I picked him up for the first time. But there was something about it that bothered me. I sincerely thought that this is a gardener and that there are gardens, summer cottages, or at least some kind of recreation center in that area, since it is very far from the nearest city or village, but there was nothing on the maps except for the forest, at least within walking distance accessibility. If this is a gardener, mushroom picker or tourist, then he should have something with him, and this one even travels without a bag. He leaves for the forest at night, and I pick him up in the morning. What to do in the forest at night? Another order from this guy. During the trip, I decided to ask where. They say, he goes. And the man so glared unkindly and is silent. He only grunted that there was no time for talking, his leg hurts. This time his leg was really bandaged, and on the way to the car he limped badly, so they fell silent. During the trip, I glanced at the leg a couple of times and that's what's interesting. The man is brunette, and from under the bandage some blonde hair sticks out and is somehow unusual. I caught myself thinking that it was not normal to look at men's legs, and this time the passenger was somehow nervous. Maybe my questions stressed him so much. I usually drive in silence, I just listen to the radio quietly. We reached the place, he paid, silently got out of the car and hobbled into the forest. I don't know what the hell made me want to be curious and follow him. I turned around, pretended to leave, parked myself on the side of the road and followed him. Surprised that there was not even a path there. All the manipulations with the machine were a matter of a few minutes, and the peasant, due to a leg injury, moved slowly, so I clearly followed him, seeing his back. 20 minutes passed like that. I was already feeling uneasy. It was almost dark in the forest, the road and the car were far behind, and I was in the forest with some strange man who was going nowhere. At this time, the peasant reached the nearest bushes, and I lost sight of him. It was the most intense moment. Minutes passed, and no one appeared from the bushes. Noticed me and hid. What will happen next? Now it wasn't funny at all. A dog runs out of the bushes. The usual shabby mongrel, limping on one paw. The light coat allowed her to be clearly seen before she disappeared into the forest. I waited a couple more minutes and walked around the bushes, no one, climbed into the very depths, empty. I tried to get back as quietly and quickly as possible. Without incident, I got to the car and drove off to the city. No more orders were received from this strange man.
My friend Elena and her husband fell victim to the coronavirus pandemic in the summer. Hospitalization was expected for a long time, as all medical facilities in the city were overcrowded. As a result, the couple still ended up in the hospital, but by that time both were already in a very serious condition. Elena fell into a coma. Periodically, she came to, as it seemed to her, and saw doctors bustling about in her ward. Among them was one very strange person. According to her, he was not wearing any medical protective clothing, instead he was wearing some kind of dark gown. This doctor constantly approached Elena, was interested in her well-being and insistently offered to transfer her to the ward where her husband supposedly lies. The strange doctor assured her that it was much better there, more spacious and the like, but some inner fear made the woman refuse these kind offers. A week later, Elena came out of a coma. She asked the hospital staff about their strange colleague. The surprised doctors said that there was no doctor in black here, and that Elena, in principle, could not talk to anyone, since she had been in a coma all this time. But the most terrible was in another. It turned out that Elena's husband died almost immediately after hospitalization. It turns out that the black doctor was trying to convince her to go to her late husband.
My husband and I are from the city, but trips to the countryside are a hobby we share. Mostly in the fall. The forest is especially beautiful in autumn, and it is more interesting to walk, mushrooms, berries. They say you have to communicate with nature. Ask permission to enter, give thanks for gifts, avoid bad thoughts. I've always stuck to this, but on this day I had a big fight with my husband. We were going on a trip and he and his friends were out. I got mad at him and went out by myself. The place was familiar, we had been there 100 times. Too bad I wasted time. We were going to go in the morning, and it was already lunchtime, and there were still a few more train stops to go and then on foot. With these thoughts in terrible annoyance, I went out to the station, walked a few kilometers along the road and went into the woods. My thoughts were occupied with the conflict, so the usual ritual of greeting did not follow. I picked mushrooms without the previous excitement. In general, I was just thinking. I was taken out of my thoughts by the crackling of branches somewhere nearby. A huge brown animal appeared, ran through the spruce forest and disappeared from sight. A chilling thought flashed through my mind: moose. Moose are quite dangerous during the rut, and a meeting with them does not bode well. While I was thinking where to go and what to do, the crackling of twigs repeated. Something huge was hurtling at high speed in my direction. My instinct gave me the command to run. I ran like I'd never run before, not seeing the road. Out of breath, I had to stop. The pursuit stopped, and it was quiet. When I looked around, I realized I was lost. I had left my basket a long time ago, and it was good that my phone hadn't fallen out. It was getting close to evening, and I still could not find my way out of the forest. I was very much afraid I would run into a moose again. The quarrel with my husband seemed like a small nuisance to me. Something small darted right under my feet. I jumped up in surprise. I saw the most common cat under my feet. It was circling around my feet and purring. Where had he come from? Groomed, shiny fur. The cat, meanwhile, meowed and ran forward, and I followed him, hoping that he was from the nearest village and knew the way home. It quickly became dark. The fluffy tail of the guide flashed ahead. I was afraid to lag behind, but it was as if he was waiting and didn't run far. He wasn't so scary, and I was sure we would make it. The trees thinned and we stepped onto the road. There was no limit to our happiness. At that moment we heard the sound of a car approaching and the headlights illuminated the road. The driver stopped. As it turned out, there were no settlements nearby. All the while, the cat was dangling at my feet. Neither the noise of the car nor the headlights frightened him, but as soon as I reached out to take him with me, he jumped up a few steps, though before he calmly let himself be petted. I stepped closer, called out to him, and he meowed, turned around, and walked back into the woods. I followed him, not wanting to leave my savior alone in the woods. The driver came out to help. At some point, the cat just disappeared from sight. Nothing to do, we got in the car and drove off. We got home late at night. At the door, I met my husband, who had already gathered a whole search party from his companions. We apologized to each other. I started to tell my husband the story of my rescue, and I wanted to show him the picture of the cat, but it was empty. Not that the photo didn't turn out, the cat just wasn't there, even though I photographed it point blank. The forest, the bushes, even the bumps on the ground could be seen, but the cat was gone. Then we went to those places many times. We couldn't find the cat.
There is an expression, children do not choose their parents. I cannot speak for all children, but my daughter definitely chose me. It would be more accurate to say that the soul of the future child chose her parents in advance. And no amount of effort can override that choice. And it is true. I will tell you about this poignant story. It was 1991. I was 28 years old. The country was undergoing radical changes in its social and governmental structure. Millions of people had lost their jobs, their benefits, their savings, their livelihoods. Almost all goods and products had disappeared from store shelves, and prices were rising every day. The country was plunging into chaos. And in these difficult conditions, I suddenly found myself in a position. I had been legally married for many years. My husband and I had a good relationship. We were raising a 7-year-old boy together, so we were a happy family. Recently we moved to a new place of residence and moved into our own house. I managed to find a good job. And then the unexpected news, like a snowball. Not that my husband and I didn't want a second child, but at that moment it was all kind of sudden. I thought about it, weighed everything up, and made the decision, one son. To make my plans come true, I went to a local clinic. It was a gloomy, rainy day. I took a long walk. I must say it was not a long walk. About halfway there I suddenly became terribly tired. I was very sleepy. My eyes were closed with heavy eyelids, my legs felt puffy, and I just wanted to sit down on the ground and fall asleep. And a bell rang in my head, "Come back." I don't remember how I got home. I remember that I went into my bedroom, collapsed on my bed, and slept for 14 hours. The next day I went to the clinic again, but the doctor told me that the situation was already critical and I wouldn't have time to take an AIDS test. The thing is that in 1991 it took 2 weeks to prepare these tests. In short, the doctor refused me. If you had come in yesterday, we would have had time to take the tests and send them together with the car to the laboratory. I should have thought back then that some force was giving a very clear sign. But I ignore that warning and don't give up on my decision. My mother-in-law had already tried to organize the next attempt. She sent me to her friend, an experienced doctor. But she looked at me and categorically refused to participate in my risky venture. It's too late to do anything. But I, as if under an obsession, followed a clearly disastrous path, and a third attempt followed. This time my good friend referred me to her sister, who worked as a doctor in a regional hospital on the other side of town. Everything was arranged in advance, what time I was to arrive, who and how to ask. In other words, everything was planned in detail for me. The female doctor was supposed to be on duty the night before. All along the way I set myself up as best I could. This time I got there without incident. The road from the station to the district hospital was wide and straight. But the mood was as lousy as the weather. It was drizzling with a light rain, and it was damp. Fallen leaves rustled beneath my feet and made me feel sad. Ahead of me on the road, a chubby boy carefully wheeled a stroller with a little girl who laughed most of the time. The boy looked about 8 or 9 years old, the girl about 2. I felt with every fiber of my being that these children were having a good time in each other's presence. It seemed obvious that such a picture should make me happy. I, on the other hand, for some reason really didn't want to look at them. I felt uncomfortable in their presence. But no matter how hard I tried to outrun them, I failed. My happy brother and sister walked ahead of me all the way to the hospital. I stepped into the completely empty lobby. The on-duty lights were on. I saw part of a checkpoint with bare hangars. There wasn't a soul around. I coughed, but the room responded with a viscous silence. I stood there, not knowing what to do. At that moment, a disheveled woman's head peeked out from behind the front desk like the devil out of a snuff box. I even flinched in surprise. And, frankly, I was scared. When I asked how to get to the doctor, the manager answered, "She's not working today. And her appointment is long over. Go home, woman. There's nothing for you to do here." I burst out, "No way. We had a deal with her. What do you mean it's not working?" And she defiantly says to me, "That's it." Something confused and frightened me in this woman. What it was, I realized already on a slushy street, where I ran out dumbfounded by everything that was happening. The woman stood behind the counter unnaturally, as if at an angle, leaning heavily to the left side, like a broken mannequin. All attempts to contact the person who was waiting for me that night at the hospital were unsuccessful. All the payphones I came across were broken. There were no cell phones at the time. After 2 hours I was able to call the doctor. It turned out that the doctor was there waiting for me. Our arrangement was still in place, and she told me to go see her quickly. She also said that they did not and never had a receptionist who matched my description. I sat in my mother's kitchen. I tried to warm myself with hot tea. My soul was in turmoil, questions were ringing in my head. What to do? Who should I turn to? But there were no clear answers, and my thoughts gradually tuned out. I remember sitting there, staring stupidly into the blackness of the evening outside the window, and I began to realize that, after all that had happened, probably only a stubborn or complete idiot would not understand that nothing needed to be done. Already 3 times someone had persistently distracted me from this insane step. Some forces stopped me, sent me clear signs, frightened me. And then the thought clearly formed in my head, don't try. No matter what, this baby is meant to be born. And so, around the 7th month of pregnancy, I had an unusual dream, which I still remember in minute detail. In the dream there was an amazing little girl. More like a teenage girl of about 14 or 15. She was tall, slim, thin, and had long, shoulder-length, copper hair. She was wearing a very short, intricately patterned green dress. She just stood there in silence and looked at me with a kind of challenge. "Here, Mommy, look who you wanted to give up." On March 29, 1992, our daughter was born a month premature. Apparently, in a hurry, the mother was unreliable. I didn't have an ultrasound, but I knew for sure it was a girl. And 15 years later she was exactly as I had seen her in that dream. Tall, with long, dark red hair. She's the same now, at 28, and her personality is as complicated as that drawing on her dress. And my eldest son used to push his little sister in the stroller, too, and she laughed merrily at him. And who says kids don't choose their parents? In fact, as I learned later, children's souls choose their parents long before they are born.
I present to your court another story about the inexplicable, and so, let's start.
I remembered something half-remembered, but unpleasant. When I remember it, I shudder. I must say that I am a classic asphalt child, having never lived in the countryside or had relatives there, but it turns out that even in a city apartment, you never know what can happen. So, once upon a time, before I was married, I dated a man who was much older than me. He wasn't the kind of guy you'd want your parents to meet. He was all twitchy and hysterical, the kind of guy who got his hands on a lot of money, which totally blew his mind. But for some reason I was crazy about him. I took all of his breakdowns for granted, ignored the opinions of his buddy friends who knew him, and had a falling out with a lot of people because of it, and I was patient and hopeful about something. And for what? God knows what. And then one day my admirer gave me a cross. It was silver, ornate, handmade, on a thick silver chain, and he just took it off and put it around my neck, saying, "I want you to have this thing." I was young and beyond happy, not paying attention to the fact that such things are actually loved by only one owner and are not usually passed down. It didn't take me long to rejoice, until the first night. I woke up to the noise in the kitchen. Jars rattled as they were put away for canning, the kettle on the stove rattled, and a chair moved. From behind the wall, in the next room, came my father's usual snoring, and there was no one else in the house, nor could there be. My first thought was that the dog was spoiling, but I remembered that the dog had been living at the cottage with my grandmother for 2 weeks, and then I got really scared. I got out of bed, reached for the light switch, and realized with horror that I couldn't move my right arm. Worse, someone or something was holding onto my left hand, preventing me from lifting it. And there was no one in the room. My nature is such that I never scream out of fear. I can lose my voice for a while if I'm completely shocked, and that's exactly what happened at that moment. With great difficulty, I reached with my left hand for the light switch, the light came on, and I saw a hand clutching behind me. Do you know what it was? Somehow my right hand was behind my back and it was tightly around my left arm, closer to my shoulder. I later tried to do it again, but it didn't work. I could reach it with my fingertips if I tried very hard, but I couldn't grab it with my whole hand. I had to be a gutter girl, that's for sure. I started swearing and yelling. The noise in the kitchen stopped immediately, and a sleepy father with the same eyes appeared on the threshold of the room. In our house, the word fool was considered indecent, and here was such a tirade. He and I went into the kitchen together. There were jars scattered across the floor, but none were broken, and the chairs were scattered in the corners for some reason. The outline of a gift chain with a cross was clearly imprinted on my neck and chest, and it stung unbearably. I took it off and threw it out the window. The blackness didn't wash off my body for another week and a half. And my man disappeared after that. He wasn't just gone from my life, he disappeared. His relatives searched for him, but, as far as I know, they never found him.